Hello, welcome to another conversation with Professor Choi. I had a student who asked me to make this video because there is pretty much every few years there's a conversation about increasing minimum wages. And I wanted to make a video to kind of explain what are the pros and cons of increasing minimum wages. Now I'm titling this video, Why Increasing Minimum Wages Too Fast May Not Be a Good Idea. Because there's really a difference between increasing minimum wages quickly versus increasing minimum wages slowly. I remember when I arrived to the United States way back in 1997, minimum wage was something like $4.25 an hour or something like that. But the minimum wage basically is a sort of reflection of the cost of living. So increasing minimum wages over time as a reflection of the cost of living, it's probably not a bad thing in general, because it goes up with the cost of living and it just basically keeps up with that. Or I wouldn't say keep up, but it tries to keep up with the cost of living. Now, increasing minimum wages rapidly, it's usually not a good thing because it creates too many disruptions in the system. Now, the way I want to explain it, because some people have been telling me, well, maybe you should take some of the math out of the explanations that you do. And I don't want to do that because the math is really what tells you how we see it as economists. And I decided to kind of do model talk, people talk, tell you about what the Congressional Budget Office has already said about this, and then give you a conclusion so that you basically figure out what's going to happen on your own, or basically so that you understand in general what we like to say about it. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about what is the minimum wage in some of the conversations. So the reason we have a minimum wage in general is because the wages that are prevailing in the market will normally not be able to keep up with the cost of living. Most people who talk about minimum wages usually bring up the cost of living, and then what you see all over the United States is basically a base given by the federal government, and then a lot of different minimum wages higher than that. So the reason for the higher than minimum usually has to do with the cost of living. So in places where the cost of living is higher, you normally end up with a higher minimum wage, and in places where cost of living is lower, you normally end up with a lower minimum wage. Again, I don't see anything majorly wrong with that, but increasing it too quickly normally creates severe disruptions in the system. Alright, so why is it that it could be a quote-unquote bad idea? Well, the number one reason why it's a bad idea on people talk, basically, is because it costs more money to do business. In other words, the cost of the business will go up. Now, I don't want you to think about labor. I want you to think about, imagine that you have a car and then all of a sudden tires go up in price. And then think of tires being that labor cost. So in order for the car to work, think about cars being a business, and then tires are an essential part of the business, aka labor. Now all of a sudden the price of tires goes up. What's going to happen when I need to replace my tires, or I need to add another tire to my business? Well, what basically happens is it's going to be more expensive for me to do so. As a consequence of that, when I'm going to sell my product, I'm going to have to charge people more money. So it increases the cost of doing business, which then increases the price that the consumer is going to receive on the other side. So it costs more money to do business, therefore the price of the product goes up. And when the price of the product goes up, we experience inflation. Now, minimum wages are going to affect pretty much every business that has plenty of people hired for minimum wages. And I want you to think about what types of business these are. These are usually the types of business that cannot sell you products too expensively. You're not going to find a lot of people working for Google at minimum wages. But you're going to find plenty of people working for McDonald's at minimum wages. In order to maintain the price of a McDonald's burger, in order to maintain the price of pizza at pizza places, they have to be able to pay those minimum wages. Otherwise, as wages rise very quickly, you're also going to see an increase in the price of pizza. You're going to see an increase in the price of that burger. You're going to see an increase in the price on retail stores. And then in many ways, what you basically did is just made everything more expensive and it becomes a wash. Okay? And that's really the worst part about increasing minimum wages. The faster you do it, then the worse it becomes. Alright, now, the second thing, and this at this point it's actually, I'm going to talk about one good thing about it. I need you to understand that people that are below a certain number on poverty, one of the things that they do is they become fairly dependent on a lot of government programs. And the reason they become dependent on a lot of government programs is because if they're just making minimum wage and they're not working enough hours, then they normally tend to also request some help from the government. And I'm talking about welfare, maybe Medicaid, sorry, maybe some food stamps or something of that sort. And if you do give those people a wage that kind of moves them out of that poverty line, then what's going to happen is we're going to have less quote-unquote poor people because you crossed the line. So I want you to think about this being like a line of income, and then below that line of income we call you poor, and then now all of a sudden you qualify for all these benefits. But if you go above that line of income, then you're no longer poor, so you don't qualify for all these benefits. If all of a sudden we increase minimum wages, then there's going to be plenty of these people who are going to cross the line to the north of it, and then all of a sudden we're going to reduce poverty. Alright? And that is a good thing about increasing minimum wages. Alright, so that's people talk. Now let's do it in an economic model so you understand the way economists see things. Now, an increasing minimum wages, really, what it is a change in an imposition from the government. So if you let the market be, you're going to have some kind of wage that is below a minimum wage, because the minimum wage is some number that is usually higher than what the market is willing to pay. The reason to explain that, I want you to think about why do we have to put a minimum wage in the first place if businesses are willing to pay normal wages or what we already expect as being a good wage. And the fact of the matter is, if a business could, they would basically drag the wage down as much as possible. So the reason we have minimum wages is because if businesses are allowed to charge whatever they pay you whatever they want, they will try to drag it down as much as possible. So the prevailing market wage is lower than the current minimum wage. So let's say that businesses are willing to pay, let's call it $6 an hour, but the minimum wage in the US, let's call it $7.25, and then the proposal that we have is to really increase minimum wages very rapidly. So what we will be doing is we will be moving that minimum wage to a much higher level, say $15 an hour. Alright, now what that basically does in our economic model, in this case supply and demand of labor, what it basically does is it increases the disparity between what businesses are willing to pay and what the amount of workers are willing to hire. So the supply line in the labor market represents the amount of workers that are willing to work. And it makes sense that as we increase minimum wages, more people will be willing to work. So in other words, as we increase minimum wages, more and more people will join the labor market because they want to work. Now, a bit of a extreme example so you understand what I'm saying. Imagine that I would raise minimum wages to $100 an hour. Then basically even your grandpa who doesn't want to work right now might want to join the labor market, because he knows that there's plenty of jobs where he doesn't have to work a lot, but if he gets paid $100 an hour, he's going to join. Alright? So the point that I'm trying to make here is, as we increase minimum wages, there'll be more people willing to work. And that is reflected by the supply line point increasing. Now, what's also going to be true is that there'll be less businesses willing to hire. So the demand line in the model represents the amount that businesses are willing to hire. And what you're going to notice is that we started at this point in the previous minimum wage, and then we moved to this point with a higher minimum wage. So the quantity demanded of workers, it's going to come down at the same time that the quantity supply of workers, it's going to increase. As a consequence of that, we're going to have a surplus of workers, or a larger surplus of workers. And a larger surplus of workers is basically an increase in unemployment. And that will be one of the largest problems usually of increasing minimum wages. And the faster you do it, the faster you're going to see that unemployment problem show up. And again, that's what the model says. Now, assuming these lines are correct, this will be the increase in unemployment generated by that. Now, the other day, the Congressional Budget Office came up with a report, and they basically said that if in the US we increase minimum wages from around $7.25 to $15 an hour, which is basically doubling the federal minimum wage, well, it's going to cost about 1.4 million jobs by about 4 years from now, but it is going to lift about 900,000 people out of poverty. And that's the estimate by the Congressional Budget Office of the effect on the economy in about 4 years from the moment that you do this. What is the conclusion? Well, you got to look at the time period that you're in. And I like to use the model to explain that. When you're in a recession, or when your economy is weak, it's a pretty bad idea to increase minimum wages because unemployment is already high. So if you decide to increase minimum wages when your economy is weak, what you're going to basically do is you're going to make unemployment worse. And that you don't want to do. You don't want to do that as a policymaker, and you don't want to do that as an individual or as a business or as a county or as a government or as anything. Not only that, it's going to make things more expensive. So at the same time that you're increasing minimum wages, you are going to increase the cost of production, which will lay off people, and then on top of that, make prices go higher. Now I want you to think about as an individual again, being hit with those two things at the same time. So more unemployment and higher prices for all the products that you consume. So, what's a good time to increase minimum wages? Bad time is during a recession or when the economy is weak. These effects you're going to see either way. Again, it's simple to understand. The model said so. Now, when's a good time? Well, let me explain that with the model. Imagine that you have a booming economy. Imagine that all of a sudden everything's kicking on the right cylinders. We don't have any major issues. Businesses are booming. Well, an increase in business basically means that the demand for labor is going to shift to the right. If the demand for labor is shifting to the right, notice that normally you would see an increase in wages either way. And then at some point, you're going to see that the wage in the market touches that minimum wages that you had before. Somewhere around that time, you can basically increase your minimum wages, and the amount of unemployment that you were creating before will basically be maintained. So if you increase minimum wages with increases in economic activity, I want you to think about the difference between like going 7.25 today, 15 tomorrow, versus going 7.25 today and then in 10 years we get to 15. Okay? If we do it slowly in a sort of step ladder way, then there's a heck of a lot less side effects to the economy. And that's really the way you want to do it. So a good time to increase minimum wages is when economic activity is increasing and businesses demand more labor. Alright? And that's really what I wanted to conclude with. Increasing minimum wages too fast creates usually a couple of bad things and one good one. The bad ones are cost of production go up, then you get inflation and unemployment. The good thing is there is a reduction in the amount of people that are poor because they will pass that threshold and no longer qualify for government benefits. The model said so. Same similar story. Conclusion. If your economy is weak and you're in a recession or you're slowing down or you don't know where you are, it's probably a bad idea to increase minimum wages, especially rapidly. If your economic activity is increasing and businesses demand more people, naturally wages will go up, so it's okay to naturally increase minimum wages or sort of slowly increase minimum wages as there's an increase in economic activity. Thank you for sticking with Professor Choi. I hope you like my explanation about why it's a good and a bad thing to increase minimum wages rapidly. Have a good one.